Carla, 29, always believed she understood the concept of an open relationship well. When she and Renato, 31, decided to give it a try, it was more out of curiosity than necessity. The beginning was calm, with clear rules and lots of communication. Both respected the boundaries and there was no drama. Carla truly believed that everything was well resolved in the relationship until the moment when, without realizing it, she crossed the line that they had both drawn. It was not a planned action, nor a conscious desire to cheat. But that night, when she got involved with someone else, something inside her began to change. When she returned home and looked into Renato's eyes, she felt that the trust between them had been shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. After that night, Carla found herself taken aback. It wasn't just the fact that she had kissed someone else or shared something intimate with someone outside of their agreement. What really messed with her head was the guilt that arose. And it wasn't just guilt, but possessiveness. She didn't want Renato to know. She wanted that moment to be just hers, as if she had somehow broken an invisible rule that they didn't even know existed. She tried to justify herself, rationalizing that he had his experiences too. But the truth was that she couldn't shake the feeling that, at that moment, their relationship wasn't so open anymore. She began to question what freedom really meant in that kind of arrangement. As the days went by, the idea that nothing had changed became increasingly untenable for Carla. She realized the depth of the emotions involved in that open relationship. It wasn't just about sex or seeking experiences outside the home. It was about the feelings that were formed in the small exchanges, in the conversations with the other person, in the shared glances. Carla felt betrayed, but not by Renato. She was betraying herself, because what she had done no longer made sense in light of her own feelings. She had always considered herself independent and thought she didn't mind possessiveness, but now she found herself stuck in what she believed to be an unrestricted relationship, feeling something she never imagined: jealousy, a need for control that she had always despised. The worst part of all was realizing that what bothered her the most was not the act itself, but the fact that she had to hide it. In an open relationship, they should be transparent and honest, but Carla was there, lying, making excuses, getting tense whenever Renato brought up the subject of them having relationships with other people. She tried to act naturally, but every gesture he made seemed to confirm what she feared, that he already knew, or at least suspected. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that bothered her, but the emotional betrayal that she didn't know how to deal with. And somehow, this began to infiltrate their relationship. Conversations that were once fluid and open now seemed forced, as if they were two strangers trying to understand where the trust had been lost. As the days went by, Carla began to realize that it was no longer a question of whether or not she was free enough to do whatever she wanted. She felt that the trust between her and Renato, which had previously seemed unshakable, was turning into something fragile and brittle. She no longer knew what she felt, but she knew that the simple idea of being someone's owner, or someone being hers, was taking more strength than she imagined. Carla wanted Renato to be only with her. She wanted him to desire her in the same way, exclusively, and to be able to feel what she felt. But at the same time, she didn't want to be the person who went against their agreement, the person who would stop being honest, just to protect her own ego. Carla was getting lost in her own contradictions, and that bothered her deeply. It was Carla who brought up the subject. With a simple comment, almost by accident, she asked Renato if he had ever been with anyone else, and his answer was calm, almost casual. But when he answered, Carla could no longer look him in the eyes without wondering what he really thought about it. Did Renato feel the same way she did? Did he also find himself struggling with the idea of possessiveness that he never imagined existed? The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Renato knew somehow that she was acting strangely. He tried to reassure her, telling her that she was exaggerating. But despite his attempts to calm her down, Carla was already immersed in a sea of doubts. It was increasingly clear to her that perhaps an open relationship was not as simple as they both imagined. Carla knew that the feeling of insecurity would not go away so easily. But what tormented her the most was the fact that she could not go back. She had gotten emotionally involved with someone else, unintentionally, unplanned, and now everything seemed out of control. Carla began to wonder why she had accepted this open relationship arrangement. It was not supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be free, without the pressure of complicated emotions or feelings of possession. But with each passing day, her freedom seemed to be more restricted, as if they were tied to something that, deep down, She no longer knew what it was, and this was eating away at her. Carla wanted to free herself, but at the same time, she was afraid of losing something that was hers, something that, deep down, she no longer knew if she wanted to share. The relationship between Carla and Renato began to change slowly, and she didn't know how to react anymore. She started to pull away, not only physically, but emotionally. She avoided talking about the subject, but at the same time, the weight of her emotional betrayal became harder and harder to ignore. Renato seemed unaffected, but Carla could see something in his eyes. Did he already know, or was he simply giving her space to process the situation on her own? Carla couldn't lie to herself anymore. Their relationship was no longer what it had been. She was stuck in an internal conflict, and somehow this dilemma felt more painful than anything else. The worst part of all was realizing that, while Carla was lost in her emotions, Renato seemed to be at peace. She began to question whether he was right, whether he really didn't care about the limits of the relationship, or whether he was more comfortable with the idea of freedom than she could be. But deep down, Carla couldn't accept her own lack of control over the situation. The jealousy, the possessiveness, everything she believed to be part of an outdated mentality was there, taking over her, and she didn't know how to deal with these feelings. Carla wanted to maintain the integrity of the relationship, but she was beginning to doubt whether that would still be possible. Little arguments began to appear, not about the fact that they had gotten involved with other people, but about what that was doing to their trust, to their intimacy. Carla tried to give Renato space, tried to deal with what she was feeling without confronting him directly, but what she didn't expect was that, sooner or later, he would also start to question what was happening. That was when, in a random conversation about how their lives were going, Renato said with disconcerting calm, "I think you cared more than you should have." Those words fell like a bucket of cold water. Not because they were an accusation, but because they reflected exactly what Carla was trying to hide from herself. She cared, and she cared a lot. The truth was that Carla could no longer see the freedom she thought she wanted. What she wanted, deep down, was the security of an exclusive love. And suddenly, everything she thought was normal in this type of relationship was falling apart before her. That conversation didn't solve anything, but it made Carla realize how far they were, losing their way. She wanted something more, but she didn't know if Renato wanted it too. She didn't even know if he felt the same way she did. Carla was there, waiting for an answer that might not even be fair, waiting for him to see that what was happening between them no longer had the same lightness as before. Everything seemed heavier. She thought about how emotional betrayal was nothing compared to what many would consider a real mistake, like a physical affair. But for her, it seemed even more devastating. Carla had lost herself in something that should never have started, and now she didn't know how to deal with the remorse. She didn't want to keep living a lie, but at the same time, she didn't know if she was ready to face the consequences of this revelation. The worst part is that when he finally talked about it, Renato didn't seem as shaken as Carla imagined. He seemed more relieved, almost as if he was waiting for her to finally see what was happening between them. Renato told her that it wasn't as simple as it seemed. He began to explain, with a calmness that irritated her, that the feelings Carla was having were naturally emerging, that he knew they could get through this difficult phase. But deep down, what Renato didn't understand was that, for Carla, it wasn't a phase. She didn't want an open relationship anymore. She didn't want to be the person who deconstructed the very idea of freedom to do something that seemed more like an emotional prison than a conscious choice. And deep down, she didn't know if she still wanted to keep it, if she still wanted this relationship. Carla was becoming increasingly confused. She felt that Renato was calmer, perhaps even more self-assured, while she could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling like she had failed. Carla constantly blamed herself for having broken off something that, according to their definition of an open relationship, should not have been broken off. But inside, something was broken. Conversations about other people, about shared experiences, began to sound like a distant echo, something that had once been natural but now sounded empty. It was no longer about being free. It was about what really mattered between them, what they really wanted, and how their emotions were getting in the way between the lines. Carla was tired of feeling fragile, insecure, and full of doubts about what was right or wrong in the midst of that tangle. Carla tried in every way to understand what was happening. She tried to rationalize everything, to put her feelings aside, but she couldn't anymore. An open relationship, to truly work, requires a level of trust that, in their case, had been lost. Every time Renato talked about his experiences with other people, Carla felt as if a knife was stabbing her. Renato wasn't wrong, and neither was she. But human emotions were not something they could control in that way. Possessiveness, jealousy, and unshared desires began to dominate their relationship. That freedom from before seemed like a joke now. In the end, what seemed like a solution to avoid the pain of possessiveness ended up generating even greater suffering, deeper and more painful than Carla could have imagined. When she finally gathered the courage to talk again, Carla realized that there was no turning back. Renato knew that something was different, and she could no longer hide what she was feeling from herself. She needed to admit that, no matter how hard they tried, that dynamic was not working for her. Carla felt vulnerable, exposed, and it was as if all her insecurities had surfaced at once. She was falling apart inside, and the words she tried to articulate came out confused and unclear. Renato, on the other hand, was calm, almost distant, listening without interrupting. When Carla finished speaking, he remained silent for what seemed like an interminable amount of time, and this made her think that he had already made his choice. He finally said that he no longer saw any point in continuing to try to follow a path that no longer made sense to her. But he also didn't know if he could change the dynamic. He seemed to understand her suffering, but at the same time, he was ready to move forward with the freedom that he still believed was best for both of them. What Carla didn't expect was that, after this conversation, their relationship would become even more difficult to deal with. There was no hatred or explicit resentment, but there was a feeling that they were on opposite sides, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. It was no longer a simple agreement. The emotional betrayal, the exhaustion, the hurt that Carla had been feeling over time, all of this turned into such a heavy burden that she no longer knew if she would be able to return to the idea of freedom that they had initially agreed upon. She was no longer sure that she would be able to deal with this type of relationship. Renato, on the other hand, seemed increasingly certain that the freedom to love and be involved with other people was the only answer to what they were experiencing. And deep down, this was what hurt Carla the most. Renato had found himself in what, for her, had become an emotional trap. She didn't want to lose what they had, but she knew that if they continued like this, they would only be deceiving themselves. After that conversation, everything was on hold. Carla didn't know what to think anymore, but something inside her was definitely changing. The relationship they had, the idea of being open, the shared experiences, all of that no longer made sense to her. She tried to rationalize, tried to understand that, by deciding to be in an open relationship, she had accepted the rules. But the emotional reality that followed was much more complicated. Carla found herself full of doubts, wondering why she had never questioned herself before about what she really wanted. She had always imagined that she could be the person who supported the other person's freedom, who could share without feeling the pain of jealousy or possession. But the truth is that, when she is confronted with her own feelings, all of that becomes much more complicated. Carla wanted the freedom of being with Renato, a feeling that they were something unique, but at the same time she no longer knew if he still felt the same way. In the following days, the silence between the two was heavy. Carla avoided looking Renato in the eyes because she knew that, no matter how much they tried to move on with their lives, the truth was that something was broken between them. Renato seemed to be at peace with what was happening, but Carla couldn't reach that place of tranquility. She didn't know if she could still move on with the idea that, somehow, they were in the same boat. Renato talked about the importance of freedom of choice, but Carla couldn't feel free anymore. She felt trapped in the dilemma of wanting more and, at the same time, being afraid of losing. When she realized that she could no longer continue in this relationship without doing something radical, Carla finally made the decision. They reached a point where there was no more room for negotiation, and the only thing left was to understand that this was no longer for her. Making the decision to end it all was harder than Carla had imagined. She knew deep down that it wasn't working, but she didn't want to lose what they had. There had been so much love involved, so many memories, so many promises that things could be different. But in the end, the emotional betrayal, the possessiveness, and the insecurities that had arisen along the way had destroyed everything. Carla couldn't stay in a relationship where she felt constantly unfulfilled, where the rules they had created were being tested in ways they didn't know how to handle. She could no longer ignore what was happening inside her. Simply walking away and admitting that she was no longer the person she thought she was freed her in ways she never imagined. When she told Renato that she wanted to break up, there was no surprise, but there was a sadness that Carla hadn't expected. He didn't try to convince her otherwise, but he knew that things had changed. Renato, who had previously seemed so sure of their choice, now seemed a little lost, as if he was trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. Carla was ready to move on, even though deep down, there was still a part of her that felt the pain of loss. Not because she loved him any less, but because what they had lived together no longer made sense. That arrangement of freedom that they had tried to build had turned into an emotional prison for both of them. Carla knew that somehow they both needed this space to grow and understand what they really wanted from each other. The following days were difficult for Carla. She didn't know how to deal with Renato's absence. The feeling of freedom she imagined she would feel after the end didn't come immediately. On the contrary, she found herself more lost than ever, trying to find what was left of herself. The loneliness was overwhelming, and Carla found herself wondering several times if her decision had been the right one. She had chosen to follow her path, but what did that really mean? They were so used to being part of each other that now, every little detail of her life seemed empty without his presence. What had she gained from her choice? False sense of freedom, perhaps. She didn't know if she had really done the right thing or if she had lost the only person who truly understood her. Time, however, began to provide some relief. The pain, even though intense, began to dissipate, and Carla began to realize that she needed to find her own definition of love and not follow the relationship model they had idealized. Over time, Carla slowly began to understand the complexity of what they had experienced. It wasn't about right or wrong, but about what really works for each of us. In an open relationship, it's not just our bodies that need freedom. Emotions also need space to breathe. Carla hadn't realized this before, but now she knew she needed to respect her own limits and learn to be honest with herself. What she learned, and what no one had prepared her for, is that the freedom we seek can sometimes imprison us more than anything else. When we try to experience everything without really knowing what we want, we end up losing ourselves. What seemed like a mature and balanced choice in reality left her on an endless search for something she didn't know what it was. Perhaps in the end, true freedom was being able to choose what truly made her happy, without being afraid to face the emotions that arise along the way. As the months passed, Carla began to rebuild herself, not in a way she had planned, but in a way that was necessary. At first, loneliness felt like a burden, but over time, it became an ally. Carla learned to enjoy her own company, to understand her own needs and emotions without the need to validate them with someone else. She began to see that her happiness did not depend on anyone but herself, and that was a revelation. She still missed Renato sometimes, but it was a lighter, calmer longing. Carla knew she had taken an important step, and that the healing process was not something that could be rushed. Learning to be whole again, without losing herself in someone else, was a challenge, but it was necessary for her own peace of mind. Over time, Renato also moved on with his life. There were no major reconciliations or dramatic goodbyes, just a slow distancing, as if time had drawn a line between them. They knew that their paths would never cross again in the same way, and they both respected that. The relationship they had was left behind, like a lesson, an experience that shaped them, but that was no longer part of who they were. Carla felt no anger or resentment, just a silent acceptance that life goes on, and that each of us needs to move on. The most important thing Carla learned was that there is no one-size-fits-all mold for relationships. Each person builds what is best for themselves, and if that breaks down along the way, it is because something was out of place from the beginning. The big controversy surrounding their relationship was not the betrayal itself, but the idea that freedom and trust have limits that we cannot ignore, and that sometimes these limits are invisible until they hurt us.